Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's great to have you with us for tonight's lecture, Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. My name's Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is based here in the History Department at Virginia Tech. The center sponsors many events like this one, some online, some in person. We sponsor academic conferences, public symposia, an annual Civil War weekend. We give out scholarships and research grants. We've done outreach programs in partnership with museums and elementary school classrooms and lots of other stuff besides. I invite you to check out our website, which is civilwar.vt.edu, to keep up with what's going on. You can also, of course, find us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. You can see all of our previous online events recorded and available on YouTube. And tonight's lecture, just in case you want to share it with a friend, or maybe you miss half of it or something like that, will be up on our YouTube channel in a few days. So you can just search for Virginia Center for Civil War Studies on YouTube, and it should be easy enough to find us. Okay, on to tonight's event. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Sarah Purcell. She is Digital Studies Chair and L.F. Parker Professor of History at Grinnell College in Iowa. She's an expert on all kinds of aspects of American history in the 19th century. She's the author or editor of several books. Among these is her first book, Sealed with Blood: War, Sacrifice, and Memory in Revolutionary America. And her most recent book, pretty much brand new, just a few months old, is, of course, Spectacle of Grief. I'll show you my copy right here, and I encourage you all to go out immediately after tonight's talk and buy one. And of course, this book, Spectacle of Grief, is going to be the subject of her presentation tonight. And the way it's going to work is Dr. Purcell will speak for around 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for discussion with the audience. You may have noticed in this Zoom interface, you cannot unmute your microphone, you cannot switch your camera on. So the way we're going to ask you to pose your questions tonight is to type them into the Q&A text box. So you can type them in, we'll see them, and we don't always get to every single question, but we certainly try and address as many as we possibly can, and we'll wrap things up at the latest by about 8:15 Eastern time. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. I know everyone in the audience is as well. So I want to say how grateful I am that Dr. Purcell is able to join us tonight. And let's give a virtual round of applause and welcome her to your screens. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the invitation. It's absolutely delightful to join you. Really, so much of the book is centered around Virginia, and it's a wonderful foray for me into Civil War studies. I really feel very excited. One of my goals actually in writing this book was to try to connect the historical discussion between the Revolutionary Early Republican periods, which I have previously done most of my scholarship on, and the Civil War period, because as I worked on the Civil War period, I just thought there was so much conversation to be had, especially about memory and national identity, and that really those are big themes in both of those historiographies. And I took to heart a statement from Thomas J. Brown about the U.S. historians kind of sometimes forgetting to talk to each other across the what seems like a giant chasm of 30 years sometimes between the early Republic and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so I'm absolutely thrilled that I've been able to do scholarship on this period now, and to have invitations to talk with you and audiences like this about this work. So I look forward to our conversation, and I'm going to share some snippets from the book, and also just talk about some of the book, and then but I'm happy to follow up any part of the book in conversation in the Q&A. So just ask any questions that you have, and I'll be really happy to approach those. So I'm going to share my screen now, since I have slides, which is a good practice for a lively Zoom talk, I think. So hopefully you will enjoy that. So the book, as Paul just held it up, but it's called Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. It's from the University of North Carolina Press, and it came out last April, and I'm really thrilled that I've had the chance to give talks like this one to share it with both scholars and members of the public and also teachers, so that we have a chance to see this. And I talk in the introduction about people would ask me for the several years that it took me to write the book, what are you working on? And I would say, funerals, and their faces would sort of fall. And I think I was a little worried that it was a little bit morbid, but really I have decided that I just need to own the spectacle funeral, the large public funeral. And it really is a very significant part of 19th century culture, of Civil War memory, and it has a lot of political significance. So really what I do in the book is I take these spectacles of grief, the public funerals, and I use them as a lens onto the late antebellum period through the 1890s, to really look at major figures and issues around the Civil War and how they related to both nationalism and to Civil War memory. And that's what's really, really interesting. You can see kind of what I'm getting at about how funerals could be this kind of ritual that would really entice the public to think about the meaning of individuals who had died, significant people who passed away, and their relationship to the themes that were so important to the Civil War and its aftermath. In this example, which I talk about in the book's introduction, this is the cover of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper from March 28th of 1874. And it's a cartoon that was a sort of cartoonist slash artistic image, sort of somewhere between an engraving, done on the occasion of the funeral of Senator Charles Sumner, the noted senator from Massachusetts who had long been an abolitionist and a radical Republican, and who died in 1874. Still famous for his caning by pressing books on the floor of the US Senate, but also long associated with the fight for African-American first emancipation and then freedom and really even equality in many ways in his career as a senator. His funeral, which was a large public occasion in Washington, D.C., followed by his body being taken on special trains to his home state of Massachusetts, where it was again lauded in very public funeral celebrations, was here depicted on the cover of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And we see here in this sort of allegorical coverage of the funeral, the figure of Columbia representing the United States, shrouded in mourning, placing a laurel wreath onto the coffin of Charles Sumner. That's a portrait of him on the shroud around the coffin. And around the coffin, you see the cartoonist, who's Matt Morgan, who Frank Leslie's had hired to compete with the popularity of Harper's Weekly. So they were trying to use their best artistic talent for this kind of cover. And Morgan depicted the kneeling, praying, crying, grieving Black men and boys to represent the sort of outpouring of grief of both actual African-American citizens and the sort of symbolic grief of Black Americans for the death of Charles Sumner, seen as their champion. And then you can also see this kind of angel of equal rights, or the angel of fame, bearing a plaque saying equal rights for all coming there. So this really, in a way, it telegraphs something of the whole argument of the book, which is these very important funerals became a part of public spectacle, and even beyond the immediate spectacle into popular culture, spread through the media in the 19th century. People were interested in reading about these funerals, seeing images of them, and that they then contributed to political debates and to the reconstitution of US national identity in the wake of the Civil War, and had a lot to do with the fight over memory of the Civil War and memory over issues like emancipation. And so the memory of Charles Sumner was something that was at issue in his death and in his mourning rituals, and this cartoon shows us how that became far more important. The cover of the book is actually also another image from later Inside the Fold, inside the same issue of Frank Leslie's, and it depicts significant Black citizens of Washington, D.C. gathered around Sumner's funeral at the U.S. Capitol. And recognizably, you can see at the head of the coffin, Frederick Douglass. Douglass is a very important figure throughout the book. He was someone, I think, who almost uniquely, among the figures that I look at, appreciated the political power of public mourning through the funeral rituals that I cover. And really, he appears in every chapter, sort of commenting on the death of public figures, attending these funerals, being a public mourner, writing obituaries, speaking. He gave a public eulogy for Charles Sumner at a gathering of Black citizens of Washington, D.C. And then his own funeral forms a part of the 5th chapter, the final chapter of the book, where public mourning for Frederick Douglass then also is part of the story at the end of the 19th century, in the changing fortunes of Civil War memory as connected to mourning for great figures associated with the Civil War. It's interesting because actually the Frank Leslie's put so much emphasis on Charles Sumner because they were really trying to weigh in on issues of Reconstruction and politics, and to make a real statement about Charles Sumner, even though he himself was, we could talk about this, a little bit sidetracked and somewhat sullied by the post-election presidential election of 1872 divides over the liberal Republican movement. But there is a sense among, especially men like Douglass, that perhaps no one would rise up to replace him. It would be difficult to find a white champion in American politics who was as interested in Black equality. And so the funeral is a good time for that contest to take shape. So that's the kind of work that the book really does. And so tonight, I'm really going to talk about another case study from the 2nd chapter, which is about a public funeral at the very beginning of the US Civil War. And I think what this does, and you can compare it to the little bit I've said here about Charles Sumner and Frederick Douglass, what this does is to show how some of the patterns in both grief and mourning, and also even patterns in Civil War memory, were actually starting to be set even as the war was very first beginning. And certainly the theme that the book discusses about how the constitution of US national identity was contested during these rituals. A funeral is a time when you're supposed to not speak ill of the dead. That goes way back. In fact, it's a time for the most laudatory expressions and speech about the deceased person. Even the idea that people should put aside their differences. That isn't always the case. In fact, it's very decidedly not the case in many of these public funerals, because people are using them to contest over rival versions of Civil War memory. But they're doing it by using the supposedly unifying language of the funeral oration or the obituary or the procession. And so funerals provide this supposedly unifying way to talk about divisive issues. And that makes it a really significant way to look at the Civil War. That's a tradition even going back to Roman funerary tradition, the sort of unifying, speaking in laudatory terms. And so that is something that we'll see. And the case that I'm going to talk about a little bit more and read a little snippet from the book and also delve into it a little bit more, really took place in May of 1861. And a few of you may be familiar with this figure, but maybe not have thought about the funeral so much before. And the story involves Abraham Lincoln. Another thing I talked about wanting to bridge the historiography. Another thing that led me into this work was actually an interest in Lincoln's own funeral, but also when I came to the realization that even though many of us have heard about Lincoln's funeral or possibly other presidents, Grant, or maybe even Jefferson Davis, if you squint at the word president, and see that presidential funerals are definitely a phenomenon in U.S. history. Lincoln's being, the largest, if one of the largest, probably the largest, especially in the 19th century. But when I started to work on the book, I realized actually there were other people whose funerals were almost as important, if not possibly as large, starting with Henry Clay in 1852. And Clay's funeral is much less discussed in the scholarship and much less understood. And many of the funerals that come before Lincoln's during the US Civil War and just before it actually set the pattern for Lincoln's own mourning. So in the example I'm going to talk about, focusing on Colonel Elmer Ellsworth at the beginning of the US Civil War. Lincoln is a character doing the mourning, but it takes on a kind of poignant tone when we kind of reflect upon it with the hindsight that we know he himself would be the object of probably some of the greatest public mourning of the 19th century. So let's kind of take that as it is. This is actually a photo of Lincoln from May of 1861. So from the month that this incident that I'm going to talk about took place. And so on May 24th of 1861, an unnamed correspondent from the New York Herald, along with the incoming chair of the Senate Military Affairs Committee, Henry Wilson, they visited President Lincoln in the White House, and they found him in a state of real agitation and overcome by emotion. And they approached President Lincoln, but the president called out, "Excuse me, for I cannot talk." And they were about to ask if Lincoln had something wrong with his throat when, as the correspondent to the Herald wrote, quote, "To our surprise, the president burst into tears and concealed his face in a handkerchief. He walked up and down the room for some moments, and we stepped aside in silence, not a little moved at such an unusual spectacle in such a man, in such a place." And after, quote, composing himself somewhat, Lincoln explained that his outburst was due to the news of the violent death early that morning of his friend and former law student, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. The Ellsworth, a Union Army officer, had led the men of his famous Fire Zouave unit across the Potomac to occupy the Confederate city of Alexandria, Virginia. And he had removed a Confederate flag in a scene depicted here by Currier and Ives shortly after, hoisted by the innkeeper, James W. Jackson, the man you see on the lower right. He had hoisted this large Confederate flag as an intentional provocation to Unionists in Washington and in Washington across the river. Ellsworth descended the staircase in the Marshall House Hotel holding the flag, and Jackson stepped out of his room and killed him with a blast from a shotgun. And instantly, Ellsworth's aide, Corporal Francis Brownell, shot Jackson with his service musket rifle and then ran through Jackson's body with the attached bayonet. So Lincoln claimed, and he explained his grief to the two visitors. "I will make no apology, gentlemen, for my weakness, but I knew poor Ellsworth well and held him in great regard. And just as you entered the room, Captain Cox left me after giving me the painful details of Ellsworth's unfortunate death. The event was so unexpected and the recital so touching that it quite unmanned me." And then he continued talking about Ellsworth in, quote, a tremulous voice, regretting that he was killed, quote, "not by the fortunes of war, but by the hands of an assassin." Now, this is a rather remarkable scene, and it's the one that I open chapter 2 of the book with. And it's remarkable to think about the newspaper recounting this very emotional scene of Lincoln crying in the White House and greeting his guests in the presidential office and recounting the story of Ellsworth's death. And later that year, the writer of a quick biography of James Jackson, the innkeeper who was killed in the account, he scoffed at Lincoln's tears, calling the image of the weeping president, quote, a mournful farce, and praised instead the, quote, sincere tears and lamentations of Jackson's wife and daughters who cried over his death. So we get this image of the kind of dueling tears between the president of the United States and the widow's tears for the Confederate so-called assassin by Abraham Lincoln, but the man defending his home on behalf of Virginians at that time. And when they battled to the death, when Ellsworth and Jackson battled to the death in this hotel stairway in Alexandria, the public mourning, which was very ritualized, which followed, turned them both, and I'm going to focus especially on Ellsworth, but turned them both into really, by many accounts, the first two martyrs of the US Civil War, one for the Union and one for the Confederacy. And the rituals of mourning, especially the huge outpouring of grief around Ellsworth's funeral, showed how the reverence for military heroes and especially those who were killed, military martyrs, you might say, which was one of the bedrock unifying elements of American national identity in the Revolutionary and early national period, could actually be used to drive a wedge between the Union and the Confederacy. So the stuff of American national identity could actually also be its undoing. The rituals of mourning themselves could play that role. And so we're going to see how that's going to work. Now, we all know, talk about hindsight, we don't only know about Lincoln's mourning, but we also know that there are going to be hundreds of thousands of more deaths in the Civil War, right? We know it's one of the largest mass death events in US history, especially per capita, even still in the age of COVID. But at the time, they didn't know that in 1861. They did not have the foresight, right? There are lots of examples of people underestimating how costly the war would be in terms of death. And not every subsequent death could be dealt with equal pageantry. But what we see is this does set something of a pattern of public mourning for some of the deaths that would be dealt with pageantry, and for the ways that this mourning was used to argue over politics and things like the national identity of the United States. Partly this was accomplished because Ellsworth, pictured here in his carte de visite by Matthew Brady, was already very well known. He wasn't just a friend and former law student of Abraham Lincoln's, but he was a somewhat famous person in the United States because he was a pretty dashing young man of about 24, and he had a long interest in military affairs. He was from upstate New York, and he wanted to receive a commission to West Point in his youth, but he didn't have the family connections or the wealth or the ability to arrange that commission. And so he studied military drill on his own while working in business in the Midwest. And he achieved wide notice in 1859 when he organized a group called the National Guard Cadets of Chicago into a Zouave unit. And you can see here a Winslow Homer depiction of Zouave soldiers from the Civil War. Soldiers who modeled themselves on Algerian soldiers from the Algerian conflict in the decades previous, and were known for their extremely colorful uniforms, the bloomer pants, the extremely colorful uniforms, and also their highly polished military drill. And Ellsworth had a lot to do with bringing that military drill to popular acclaim. He was known for these basically shows of military drill that he organized throughout 1859, and for the flashy uniforms that he put forward. And so in 1860, Ellsworth left the National Guard Cadets and he returned to Springfield, Illinois to study law under Lincoln and William Herndon. So right in 1860, during the presidential election, he was working with Lincoln, and he was what we would call sort of a political organizer in that campaign. And he had some schemes to enact a militia system for the United States in 1861, but when that failed, he went to New York City and he organized his unit, his new unit, the 11th New York, dubbed Ellsworth's Fire Zouaves, because he mainly recruited from New York City firemen, who were, of course, a group notoriously known for their sort of rowdy toughness, if not sort of outright, sort of gangs of New York style behavior. It's a little bit post that period, but they were a notably rowdy and masculine set that he recruited from their ranks. So they were then almost immediately enlisted into federal service, and they were one of the first volunteer companies to arrive in Washington, D.C., first headquartered in the U.S. Capitol and then camped across from the Navy Yard when the war started. And so then on May 24th, the day after Virginia seceded from the Union, the unit was dispatched, as we saw, from Washington, D.C. to occupy Alexandria, Virginia. The man that he encountered, right, Jackson, was also pretty well known. He had been a Virginia militiaman. He had, for instance, been present at the action against John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He was very vocal pro-slavery man and very anti-Lincoln, and he was an early supporter of secession, and he was known as something of a hothead. And he was also very well known for the exact flag that Ellsworth cut down. There were notices in the newspapers that Actually, it could be seen and observed from Washington, D.C. across the river. But Jackson contended that he was merely showing his political commitment with that giant flag, and he declared in what some later thought was sort of prophetic fashion that if anyone tried to remove his flag, quote, there would be 2 dead men about when that flag came down. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The military action in Alexandria was actually relatively calm. The Union forces took the city with little resistance, but then Ellsworth decided he wanted that flag. He said, boys, we'll have that. We must have that flag down before we return. And so it's a little bit ironic almost in that it really isn't part of the military conquest, but it is almost purely a political act where Ellsworth is going up to remove this sign of Confederate defiance from the top of the hotel. And so at the end of the exchange, as we heard in Lincoln's words, we have the hotel keeper dead and pinned to the floor by a bayonet, and Ellsworth also dead. And the public mourning which would follow was closely tied to their popularity and their life stories, and to Ellsworth's connections with Lincoln. That's a big part of why he was mourned. When the furor at the Marshall House died down, Ellsworth's body was wrapped in the flag and taken to the Navy Yard, where it was embalmed and visited by hundreds of sorrowing spectators, including President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln, who went to the Navy Yard to see his body before being taken back to Washington, D.C. And then Abraham Lincoln arranged for Ellsworth's body his remains to lie in repose, or really almost lie in state, at the White House, where they were also viewed by thousands before a formal funeral in the East Room of the White House. And that's what's depicted here. I hope you can see it. I think it comes across pretty well on Zoom. This is an Alfred Waud drawing, pencil sketch of the funeral with, you can see beneath the very ornate chandelier in the East Room of the White House, with the preacher giving one of the invocations. And you can see ladies with their handkerchiefs crying, and the assembled military officers. And then just in the center above the coffin is President Lincoln kind of holding his head in this. So this is the state funeral in the East Room of the White House. And like I said, they can't afford to do this every time a minor officer gets killed in a political skirmish much longer after this, but you can see the enormity of Lincoln's commitment to this. It was really unusual, extraordinarily unusual, for a fairly low-ranking officer or anyone other than a president to be given a White House funeral. But it was seen as very significant at the time because Lincoln was agitated and the public was super interested. Ellsworth's body was then paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue, which was lined with mourners after the White House funeral. And the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Zoave Brownell, who killed Jackson, was a great center of attraction. As he walked in line, his eyes still red with weeping. He carried the secession banner bathed with Ellsworth's blood. And you can see in this carte de visite from 1862, a year later, this is Brownell, and he's standing on a Confederate flag. Maybe just a prop, maybe part of the actual Confederate flag. He did keep part of the flag in his possession until later, and the family also had part of the flag. There are a few museum collections that also claim to have parts of the actual flag from the Marshall House Hotel. It's kind of an interesting sort of like a relic of this battle. But Brownell definitely had part of it until much later in his life. But I suspect this might be a prop at the photography studio. But either way, he's depicted here standing on the Confederate flag to invoke his association with this scene. A specially shrouded train, and I'm going to show you a map here, then took Ellsworth's remains to Philadelphia, where they were transferred to another train headed for New York City via Jersey City. And then in New York City, Ellsworth lay in state at City Hall and was visited by thousands more mourners who by this time were captivated by coverage of Ellsworth's death in the Northern newspapers. And I mean all of the Northern newspapers. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles across the North and many articles in the South, which was still publishing rather robustly in May of 1861, covering his funeral and the mourning and the scene at the Marshall House. The newspapers emphasized the scale of public mourning in New York City. And for instance, they had to have the viewing of his remains in City Hall rather than originally as planned at the Astor House Hotel, because it wasn't large enough to accommodate everyone. And that's in New York City, a city that was fairly accustomed to large public rituals and even to some big public funerals before this, including one for Henry Clay. The New York Times claimed that at least 10,000 people viewed Ellsworth's remains at City Hall, and another observer felt that the crowds were so large that they, quote, almost defied computation. His body was then taken by steamboat Francis Skiddy to Albany, where it again lay in state inside the hall of the State Assembly and was viewed by additional, quote, vast numbers of mourners. And cities across the North flew their flags at half-mast during this week. And after Albany, Ellsworth's parents conducted his remains to his hometown of Mechanicville, New York, where he was buried with additional military ritual, and every detail of this ritual was covered by the newspapers. The New York Times correspondent pronounced it a simple yet deeply impressive burial ceremony that would please even city dwellers who were tired of the pomp, but felt the deep current of genuine sorrow for Ellsworth's burial. All the illustrated news weeklies, in addition to local newspapers, covered Ellsworth's funeral procession, as well as the events here. So Frank Leslie's published a large pictorial of the ceremonies, accompanied by a biography of Ellsworth praising him. Harper's Weekly, that you see here, did a very large pictorial story about the incident at the Marshall House, and also depicting on the inside the Zouave camp. And if you can see the under headline here, the murder of Ellsworth, like portraying Confederates as murderers, James Jackson as a murderer. The New York Illustrated News also ran engraved stories, and so readers far and wide could really get engaged in the action of both the scene at the Marshall House and of the mourning for him. Now, what's really kind of, there are many notable things about this, which are big parts of the other funerals, so I'll just touch on a few of them for the last part of what I'm going to talk about here. One is that Ellsworth was really treated as a martyr, almost literally. His blood on the flag, visual images of him, the fact that his body had been embalmed and people could come and take a look at his body, which actually only magnified public fascination with Ellsworth's body. John Hay wrote in Atlantic Monthly in 1861, Atlantic Magazine, that Ellsworth's body was comparable to a well-muscled, quote, antique sculpture. So his body really possessed a large degree of fascination, and it had created a sort of manly ideal. Simultaneously, he was praised for being someone who had control of his emotions and had the kind of reserved masculinity or manhood of the 19th century. And for instance, he was able to control the fire Zouaves, who were seen as kind of, the hot, sort of very aggressive form of manhood, and he referred to them as his pet lambs. So he was able to exercise this kind of control over military masculinity, and all of that contributed to the public's fascination with not only his death but his beautiful appearance even after death and embalming. Lots and lots of comments from onlookers and in newspapers about his facial expression. And the kind of thing you might see people talking about family members and their bodies, and in this case, applied to the Union cause, that he had sanctified the Union cause with his blood, with the manner of his death, and now with the public mourning, the unity of the public would be seen. The press also claimed that visual contact with the murdered Ellsworth would help to motivate the coming fight. Lots of newspaper articles talked about how, quote, many persons, especially soldiers, have taken a farewell look at him. And in fact, not just his actual body, his embalmed body, but visual images of Ellsworth started to play something of the same role. So in this very Currier and Ives engraving, which came out in many different versions, so black and white versions, hand-colored versions, sort of knockoff versions. You could see even the Harper's Weekly cover, right, has a they echo one another in this visual image. It was very popular. It was sold in a number of different instances. And his visual presence also started to be a regular part of public culture and popular culture, such as Civil War covers envelopes here. And you can see a few examples of that. He who noteth even the fall of a sparrow will have some purpose, even in the fate of one like me. This is a quote from Ellsworth's last letter, his farewell letter to his parents, the letter, you know, if I should die, open this letter. And it was featured on a lot of both stationery and envelopes. Other envelopes depicted the fire Zouaves. You can see here linking them to the Union cause, one flag, one country, or this one, to Richmond, remember Ellsworth. So the cry of remember Ellsworth, sort of directly egging on first the Zouaves, and then that was exploded into perhaps being able to egg on other enlisted men. Now, I'll just say one thing about this, which is, okay, let's go back to this for a moment. I will say the same engraving was used by some Confederates. And I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but if people have questions, I can answer that. Because Jackson himself was also elevated to a lesser, but something of a martyr. And if you look at it, you could use this same image if you venerated James Jackson in a way, because he's in civilian clothing. And the contention by the Confederates that, of course, this is a great representation of strong Southern manhood just protecting my home against Lincoln's invading abolitionist hordes, or Lincoln's Northern Black Republicans. You could see a case to be made just in the visual nature of this. And so it's a visual that's very malleable and could be used as an object to egg on both sides. So use this image of death in order to get both sides fired up about the cause. Other forms of popular culture accompanied Ellsworth's public funeral, such as sheet music, and also other kinds of poetry, sort of ephemera is the category we would call it, but very quick publications, such as this set of song lyrics, named after another company that dubbed itself the Ellsworth Avengers, a newly organized regiment of Zouaves, the 44th. The Ellsworth Avengers, in turn, inspired at least two versions of this song, and it was likely used in recruiting. So we could get together and sing the song about Ellsworth's death and its need to be avenged in order to carry that on. And you could see that there are many, many examples of even recruiters saying that they would use Ellsworth's memory to fire up people to enlist, men to enlist, and hatred at the Confederacy. And on the flip side, Jackson's memory is also used in the other way. And you could see this is actually almost a parody of the Ellsworth Avengers song from Virginia Archive, which is Remember Ellsworth, which then treats Ellsworth as that noted burglar, as you can see in the very first thing. So Confederates sort of mocking the notion of remember Ellsworth, because actually Jackson was the hero, though murdered by Brownell, as you can see. This was printed in Baltimore, and we can see that. So basically, this scene and the public mourning, the funeral for Ellsworth, the way his memory, the visual contact with his death, and the visual contact with his corpse and his remains as it traveled throughout the North to be buried, all of it went into firing up the Union cause. It also very much made that Union cause about unionism. It made the sacrifice of white male officer bodies the point of the Union cause. It didn't bring up a lot of discussion of slavery. There are one or two times where people were sort of talked about that ideal, but Ellsworth was not a huge abolitionist. He was tied to Lincoln's early vision of the war. But that notion that dying for the cause was what was really important. And on the flip side, Jackson was created as something of a minor martyr as well, very important to initially firing Confederate enlistments and the Confederate cause. And we can see how that divide over exactly heroicizing the sacrifice of military heroism and over the bodies of dead military officers like Elmer Ellsworth, that which was supposed to bring the United States together, as it had done in the Revolutionary War, even the Mexican War, other prior US wars, here it was tearing them apart. And it would actually have something to do with creating both the wartime US nationalism, but also Confederate nationalism. And as those continue to be opposed, the story of mourning and military loss will continue to be a part of that contest. So I'm going to stop there talking about Ellsworth. And like I said, there are many other chapters that follow that. The book ranges from 1852, starting with Henry Clay, and really ends in the 1890s, looking at the funerals of, as I said, Frederick Douglass and also Winnie Davis, the daughter of Jefferson Davis, in the final chapter, with a lot of other officers and politicians and other important, notable, even one businessman, philanthropist throughout that period. And so it's not just officers, but I think this gives you a sense of how the war and public mourning were really tied up together. So I will stop there, Paul. I think that's about how long you wanted me to go.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. And I'm curious, having looked at the book before, about the case study format, and specifically how you selected the case studies you did, and maybe even who got left out. I notice one glaring absence is Lincoln, who's in the book, but doesn't have a chapter to himself. So could you talk a little bit about how that selection
Sure, absolutely. And as I said, part of my my rationale for the whole project was, okay, presidential mourning, but also these other figures. And so I wanted it to be explicitly about public mourning for figures who were not presidents, and because there really has been something of a scholarship, which I try to be in dialogue with, and a huge scholarship on Lincoln's funeral and mourning, and not just scholarship, but really veneration. There's a recreation of his lying in state in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, his home in Springfield, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a cottage industry all unto itself. And so I was trying to respond to that and contextualize it, while not ignoring it. I mean, it's certainly important, but I thought that, like, yet one more rehearsal of Lincoln's funeral, it's important to see how these other ones fit with it, but it wasn't exactly what I was going for. Is a little bit more about the overall culture of mourning and the kind of unexpected side. So that's why Lincoln is not included. So other than president, I didn't think, other than presidential doesn't sound so good in a book title. So that's kind of not in the title, but you get the idea of why that's there. But having said that, the way I selected the case studies was I started by researching lots and lots of the largest funerals. I just researched a lot of different mourning traditions and things that were important. And honestly, these were, I feel fairly confident in saying the largest, many of the largest. So Henry Clay, for instance, who in a way seems interesting to include a funeral that happened in 1852, but maybe not to include Lincoln's funeral, even though he famously eulogized Henry Clay in 1852. Lincoln famously eulogized Henry Clay in 1852. But Henry Clay's funeral is really the one that sets the pattern for all the subsequent funerals in the 19th century, and I would argue even in the 20th century. His is really the first very, very large national scale public mourning, and the funeral that achieves this kind of spectacle. George Washington's funeral is important in public culture. There are mock funerals for him, and there are lots of funeral sermons and newspaper coverage, but public culture itself was not as large when he died in 1799. And I think there's a case, well, I hope I make the case that the advent of things like steam printing and the telegraphic communications and train travel and steamboats, all of those things having come in after George Washington's death, just make it possible that basically there's public culture on a grand scale by the 1850s. And I went back and forth. Some people, wondered why would Clay be included in a book on Civil War memory. But just as you wouldn't write a book about the Civil War itself without talking about the antebellum period or talking about the dissolution of the Union, I think Clay really stands for that. And his funeral was all about the anxiety about the Union dissolving and what would happen to compromise now that the great compromiser was dead. So that's why it's the antebellum run-up, and he truly sets the pattern. And all the other chapters have basically a Northerner and a Southerner paired. So I tried to pair them. Clay, because he made a case and other people made the case that he transcended the regions, and sometimes he was seen as a Westerner and sometimes as a Northerner and sometimes as a Southerner. And he sort of stands in for both North and South as the compromiser. And then they split apart in the 1860s. So that's why it's structured that way. And so really, they're the biggest, most important funerals. Not to say there weren't other important funerals. We know there were, and there are notable instances. But then also there was a little bit of a selection of the ones that had maybe the greatest impact on the debates over Civil War memory and the most national attention. Some of the other rather large funerals were important in either one state or one region, or maybe only to the north. So there are, there's newspaper coverage and there's ritual mourning around a lot of other figures. But these are ones that were noted in both the North and the South, and often in the far, as far as Hawaii in many cases, right? So they're really of national importance. And because I wanted to look at the reconstitution of national identity, I thought that was really important. And it spoke to a certain function of these particular funerals. And sometimes that's kind of surprising. So the inclusion of a figure like George Peabody, who was, a businessman and philanthropist who lived most of his life in England. But nonetheless, his funeral was hugely important, and he was very tied up in Reconstruction politics and kind of contending over Reconstruction. And so, if you just off the top of your head wondered, who are the top 10 funerals of the 19th century, I don't think anybody now would say George Peabody. There are lots of things named after him: Peabody Institutes, the Peabody School of Education at Vanderbilt University. He gave money to all of those things, and they were all named after him. But I don't think most people outside of a small part of New England, or maybe outside of those institutions, know who George Peabody is today. But his funeral was massive, partly because he was first buried in England, right, and given a funeral at Westminster Abbey, and he was beloved of Queen Victoria. So it becomes this pageant of Anglo-American competition as well. And so it kind of introduces that theme. So basically through research and through looking at the national impact.
Yeah, and it seems to me as though you ended up with a really great selection of different kinds of people at different moments in time, and yet they all have that same sort of tension running through the funerals of national unity versus division and sectionalism before the war, and reconciliation or not after the war. So yeah, I think they work really well. And George Peabody was fascinating. I think if nothing else, people should take from this book an understanding of how important he was in the 19th century and how well known. And I really like how he brings in the international dimension as well.
Thank you. Yeah, me too. I didn't really know much about him before working on that story, and it's pretty enlightening. I agree, the international demand, and we're all trying to look at the global context for U.S. history, and so I think it's important to not miss that when it is really important.
Absolutely. So a different kind of question. You mentioned at the beginning that maybe the topic is somewhat morbid, and one viewer is interested in the practicalities of keeping bodies preserved, during these long periods of time when they're touring the country. You mentioned that Ellsworth's body was embalmed, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how that worked. And also, were there concerns about diseases when people came to view the remains of these people?
That's interesting. I haven't seen it. I don't remember any comments about diseases. I don't actually remember anyone commenting on that, which is interesting because you would think that might be a factor. Maybe maybe some worries about people congregating for some of the funerals, especially I'm thinking possibly of Stonewall Jackson's funeral, in 1863, like right in the thick of the war, but not so much that the body itself would communicate that disease. They were far more worried about battlefield deaths at that point and mass contamination of water and things like that. So, but yeah, the preservation of the remains is a really important factor because, as you heard in this story of Ellsworth, if you're going to venerate the remains almost as saintly relics, you have to be able to have some contact with them. And Ellsworth was a very early example of embalming. He was embalmed by Thomas Holmes, who actually essentially made his career as an embalmer, partly on his fame for having been the man who embalmed Elmer Ellsworth. So he advertises himself as Elmer Ellsworth's embalmer. So you can see that has some important commercial aspect. So many of the bodies were embalmed from 1860 onward. Henry Clay was not embalmed, but preserving his remains was still a big concern because he also was toured around on special trains and boats, and really even much further than Ellsworth, for more than a week. And his body was maintained in a sealed cast iron coffin, called a Fisk's patent coffin. And the idea was that it was supposed to use airtight technology to keep the body whole. And it had a glass window over the face with a metal plate that could be removed. So they sealed him tight in this airtight cast iron coffin. It was kind of shaped like an Egyptian sarcophagus. It was patterned on an Egyptian sarcophagus. And he wasn't the first notable figure to be buried in this way, but because his funeral became so big, he was the most notable one to use this coffin. John C. Calhoun had actually also had a Fisk patent coffin. It's fascinating to think about. Anyway, so they took his body, and when he was stopped in various cities, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, they would open the glass window and people could take a look inside. It's effective here with the zoom window. And then but the problem was there were a few issues because the seal didn't work perfectly, and it was very hot when Henry Clay died at the end of June in 1852. And by the time he got to Kentucky, they kind of had to say nix the opening of the thing because he was starting to decompose. And so, but it was noted in the papers. It was kind of embarrassing. But even though that happened, Fisk's patent coffins advertised for years as the coffin that Henry Clay used, and it was the official coffin of Henry Clay. And they're even to the point where the New York Times had an editorial piece that said it was of questionable taste. We're all for business and commercialism, but we wonder, when coffin makers are advertising using politicians, maybe that's gone too far. So, and there's an interesting, I actually, elsewhere, I've published a separate article outside the book looking at Henry Clay's coffin. I think it has to do with even the sort of Whig politics, and it's tied up with, the business respectability. You're going to sell this coffin that's going to preserve the remains of Henry Clay, and the notion that it would be sort of followed with this advertising. This is what I'm talking about, that no one could have come up with that in 1799. You would not have had advertising like that. Nobody had, Henry Clay's coffin. They were, of course, by this time selling things at George Washington's tomb. Lots of people have looked at that kind of thing. Canes made out of the tree over George Washington's tomb. So there's something about the commercialism of the mid-19th century that gets involved there. But yes, the bodies continue to be really important, and embalming is the way many of the other, most of the other, I think maybe all of the other subjects were embalmed, and the public was encouraged to mourn and basically to have open coffins. The exception being perhaps Joseph Johnston, who wanted to have a very quiet funeral, even though he himself was really involved in tons of other funerals. And that's one of the things I talk about in the part that focuses on him. But he sort of wasn't allowed to have a quiet funeral, even though he wanted to. So
right. On the subject of the open casket, another viewer is wondering, how typical that was. Obviously, you've said in these big public funerals, that's the way they're going. Is that true of kind of ordinary people's funerals as
Well,
well?
it's interesting. Ordinary people, I mean, lots of ordinary people, especially in the 1850s, people would have been much more used to contact with dead bodies, right? And even their loved ones, because people often kept bodies at home, prepared them for death at home. Undertakers were just becoming a thing by 1861. So there had been a tradition of people preparing bodies and even burying their loved ones, perhaps themselves. But the advent of the rural cemetery movement and the advent of the undertaking cause, and actually the scale of death in the Civil War itself accelerated that. That's something Drew Faust talks about in this Republic of Suffering, the kind of link between commercialism of death and the scale of death in the Civil War. And so there, and you see during the war a real fascination with people trying to preserve trying to get back their loved ones' bodies who had been killed in the war. Some of them being shipped on ice to get back home, sometimes mostly officers, maybe being embalmed. There were kind of mobile embalmers who went around, but the vast majority of men killed in the Civil War, or even women killed by disease, or refugees, that sort of thing, were buried in more mass graves. But you can see then an interest in their bodies after the war, trying to repatriate bodies, national cemeteries, Confederate cemeteries, that whole thing. So there was, and even in the precursor to the Civil War, I should also mention postmortem photography as a kind of, I think, a linked genre to this. So all of this talk about Ellsworth's body, it's very shocking to us. It wouldn't have been quite as shocking to people in the 19th century. It would have been something that they would have seen as normal. But I think these cases, like Ellsworth, what they didn't do was put their body on display for hundreds and tens of thousands of people, or write about them in newspaper articles. So you might be used to seeing your own dead child in a photograph, or your dead husband laid out in the dining room, but you didn't, invite the entire state of New York to come and take a look at them. So it's kind of the spectacle part that I think. So I think this is a normal phenomenon blown up by technology and politics, and even these kind of quasi-religious, it's sort of secularized religious overtones in many cases. And so taking the association with the bodies of loved ones and making them into a political cause or a cultural moment of a sort. So yeah, there's a continuum between family death and public figures.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of religion, you just mentioned one viewer is interested in how, your emphasis in the book is very much on the political uses of these funerals and the memories of the dead people. How did this fit in with religious rituals and funeral traditions? Were the religious elements downplayed in these big public funerals or not?
Yeah. Excuse me. Pardon me. The religious elements were more or less there in it. Some funerals more religious than others. There's usually a religious service, a religious funeral, probably least so in this Ellsworth example that I showed you. Almost all the other examples in the book, there is a church service. Some of them are quite large, and some of the church services. So, like Frederick Douglass had a very large religious funeral in one of the largest AME churches in Washington, D.C. It was a real cultural event, and the church service itself was actually the focus of a lot of the public mourning, especially in Washington, D.C., and then also later in Rochester, New York, after his body was transported. In part, that may be because he was actually denied the opportunity for a more state funeral. His body there was a suggestion that Douglass should lie in state himself or lie in honor in the U.S. Capitol, but that was blocked by Democrats. And so he was not allowed that. And the church maybe stood in for it because like the Supreme Court justices and Congress people went to the church service in that case. It sort of played the role of now we would see a funeral like that taking place at the National Cathedral, which is an Episcopal cathedral, but is used for these kind of sort of state occasions when people like Colin Powell or even presidents die. They often have a church service at the National Cathedral, but that wasn't built until the 20th century. So church services play a big part. Many of the services are either Presbyterian or Episcopal. Many of the figures in the book were parts of those religions. Even though, as you probably picked up, and I was using this language on purpose, there are sometimes some Catholic overtones, or maybe they're undertones in some of these. So the kind of veneration of saintly relics, you know, it draws from Catholic tradition, even though the dominant culture is much more Protestant, and probably would have been horrified by the idea that they were observing something sort of quasi-Catholic with that. But yeah, so, and then the other place where religion, so there are notable church services. Sumner had a very big church service as part of his funeral. So, and sometimes the services take place simultaneous to, like, the body will be lying in state, and then the churches around the city will have gatherings during a certain day or as the body is passing through town. And then also there is the proliferation of services. Sometimes memorial services are held for people. This is true of both Clay and Sumner in cities very far from where they are. And for instance, Sumner had many services preached in his honor, memorial services in churches in the South, including many, many Black churches in the South. So that, and Black preachers. And then those sermons would sometimes be reported on in the newspaper or even reprinted as pamphlets. So there are hundreds of pamphlet sermons for these people, and it becomes it's kind of a genre of the mourning literature. They're often similar to newspaper obituaries, but obviously different in form, and have a kind of usually take some kind of, you know, religious text, and they often make a political point also. So you can't totally separate the religion and from the politics. You know, like, is a Black church service in South Carolina in 1874 an apolitical event when it's a church service in honor of Charles Sumner, the dead white senator for Massachusetts? No, it is not apolitical, but it is also religious, right? So they tend to be fused.
Yeah, thank you. We're getting some great questions here. Just a reminder, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any point. The next question concerns, you know, people like Charles Sumner, also Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens, who attracted more of a biracial mourning crowd. You just mentioned Sumner with the attention from Black churches in the South. And it seems as though in many of these cities, there was biracial attendance at the events and that kind of thing. So how did people respond to that? Like, in the press, did people remark on that? Did they complain about this? Did they see it as a good thing for the most part?
Yeah, usually it was often remarked on by the press. Usually it was remarked on as a good thing, no matter who was doing the remarking. You know, segregation aside, you know, that's not strictly established yet, although we'll talk about the 1890s in a minute. It usually was talked about as a sign of unanimity. And this theme in the morning that I was talking about, where funerals promoted union and promoted the either keeping the union or a reconciliation, kind of a coming together. And so even of someone like Robert E. Lee, you would see newspapers in Richmond commenting like, oh, even the Black businesses were shrouded in Black cloth. Of course, the Black business owners came out in mourning for Robert E. Lee. And it kind of is related to the loyal slave trope, right? Like, looking at, you know, of course, there's support from the Black community for someone like Robert E. Lee. Now, that's very, very different than, you know, the press talking about Black mourners coming out for Charles Sumner, you know, and it's definitely a different context. But in both cases, the press, whether it's Republican or Democrat, uses the presence of Black and white mourners together to comment on, like, look, this shows that everyone in our community really is sad about this person's passing. Now, they might be viewing it from the completely opposite standpoint. And in fact, it's one of the most fascinating parts. The exception to this is actually Frederick Douglass. When Henry Clay died and when his body passed through Rochester, Douglass publishes a scathing. I mean, he was publishing his newspaper in Rochester at that point, and his body actually came through Rochester just before Douglas's famous "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. And I make a claim in the book. I think that it actually influenced his thinking in that speech, which is not necessarily something folks have noticed much before. And Douglas is so critical of, look, all these people, even Black men, are showing up to mourn Henry Clay, who is a slave owner and who is the author of the Compromise of 1850. And we should just like shut the coffin and leave him dead and don't shed a tear over this dead slaveholder. That's not what we should be doing. And if you listen carefully, it's resonant of the, you may be celebrating the 4th of July, but I must mourn, right? I hear the sound of clanking chains. And so Douglas is the one person, and not just the one, there were other abolitionists who argued that about Clay, that like, look, we shouldn't be saying this. And then that does get contested, for later on. Douglas also says the same thing about Robert E. Lee. Look, this is absurd. Why are Northerners saying Robert E. Lee is a good person? Like, this is ridiculous. He calls it crocodile tears that the Northerners are shedding for Robert E. Lee when he passed away. And so Douglas is one of the people who kind of gives the lie to this kind of false unity that is depicted in many of the mainstream newspapers. Interestingly, Douglas also garnered biracial mourning or multiracial mourning from both whites and Blacks, but it's a great example of it meaning drastically different things depending on who's doing the mourning. Even white Southerners and Democrats mourn Douglas as a great Black man, but it also inspires virulent racist backlash and has a big effect on fusionist politics in North Carolina, for instance. And so it's super fascinating that just that work of like depicting Black-white unity in all these different ways can really have a lot of different political consequences depending on who's deploying that as a trope or an argument or even the mourning ritual itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So now back to 1861 and Elmer Ellsworth, the incident that you talked about in your presentation, and specifically Brownell. There's a question about how he was depicted, how much was he villainized? What did the press have to say about him?
Yeah, well, he's depicted as kind of a wide-eyed, youthful, heroic by the Northern press, by Courier and Ives, by the photograph that you saw, and depicted in Northern newspapers as his faithfulness to Ellsworth, that he hadn't washed the blood off of himself for days. He was still by Ellsworth's side. He was absolutely vilified by Confederates and by Southern newspapers and by James Jackson's biographer, seen as the murderer of Jackson. He was known for decades after. He was still quite famous for having been the defender of Ellsworth, really kind of followed him the rest of his life even. And he moved to St. Louis. He lived in St. Louis later on, and he may have also lived in Indiana for a time, but I think he died in St. Louis. He and his brother had a business in St. Louis. And there were a number of other famous photographs of him depicted with the flag. He was, it's interesting. I talk about this later in chapter 2, the image of him as a New York firefighter is one that's really seized on by a lot of the Confederates, to kind of depict him as this like unruly, out of control. And actually they use the trope of the Bowery Boy, this kind of noted character from the theater in New York who was a kind of overly masculine and yet somehow sort of homoerotic at the same time, figure who wore dandy clothes, think Zohav's dandy clothes, and smoked cigars, and they were just these out of control New York street toughs. And that was used in combination with this kind of invading Abraham Lincoln horde. It was quite effective if you think about the kind of juxtaposition of Jackson's manliness, defending his home, keeping his wife and daughters safe within his home from these rowdy New York toughs who were just out of control and maybe sexually threatening. And so like Brownell is really someone who also is like super polarizing. And you can see that is he a hero or is he a villain? And it's 100%. His score would be 100% on both sides. There's a little bit of a memory of that. I mean, I think it's faded a lot by the 1870s. There's a series of newspaper articles. I don't think this is in the book, the final version of the book. At the end of Reconstruction, where I think it's the patent office in Washington, D.C., where it's like Brownell's niece and one of Jackson's granddaughters or something end up working in the same office, in the patent office, and the newspapers have this coverage like, isn't this crazy? The descendants of Brownell and Jackson are like now working, and I think it's kind of a play on reconciliation. Like, look, even Brownell and Jackson descendants can get together. So it was still enough of a something that the public would know what they were talking about by the 1870s that people would talk about it. But I think, became more of a regional story after that. Ellsworth is not someone who is really a super national hero or that people have heard of in the 20th century. He's known about by Civil War historians, but certainly not the general public, as people would, people know who Frederick Douglass is or Robert E. Lee. They probably wouldn't know who Elmer Ellsworth is, or Francis Brownell, even less.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, any thoughts on kind of the lasting impact of these Civil War era public funerals? Did they influence modern funeral traditions? Did that vary by region? Did it vary between African American and white people?
Yeah, they did influence. They influenced mostly our large public funerals, and I would put those in at least two categories. One is the kind of funerals of popular figures, so people like Buffalo Bill or Michael Jackson, or there's a lot of Judy Garland. There's lots of examples of public figures whose funerals have been culturally important, and in those cases also encapsulates some debates in public culture. So the notion that a funeral is something that might incite public interest and even be televised. Think, Princess Diana, that sort of thing, or even, I don't have to, the other thing is I don't have to prove it to anyone after the Queen's funeral a couple of months ago, that funerals are really a big spectacle that people pay attention to. And these are kind of aping European tradition in a certain way. So there's that. But so number one is the kind of funeral as cultural event. I think that has continued. The second track is they really had a material effect on state funerals or government sponsored funerals. I would say national funerals might be the best term for it. People who lie in state in the US Capitol or lie in repose in the US Capitol. And the afterword of the book, I look at the funeral of Representative John Lewis in 2020 and how his funeral, he lay in state in the US Capitol, and really only the second African-American ever to do so. And his body then also traveled to church services in both Alabama and Georgia. And for instance, his remains were taken across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in a carriage with public mourners. The form is strikingly familiar if you read the rest of the book. And I think there are a lot of other kinds of culture now that contend for our attention. It's not true that you would have to pay attention to John Lewis's funeral the way that people in the 19th century, they all read the newspaper. Like that's what they had to pay attention to. Or Harper's Weekly, is very, very dominant. Frank Leslie's, these are very, very popular trans-regional publications. And so I think it has to do that. It has that implication. So the forms are still influential, and even some of the things like carriages, which you might not be, and it's also still the case that they can be put to political uses, but of course the context is completely different. So the surrounding context is very, very different. And I don't think they have a huge influence on private funeral rituals necessarily, other than things like embalming still being a thing, and buying fancy coffins and things, but those all have other kinds of influences in the history of funerary traditions, many of them having to do with commercialism in the 20th century. So
yeah, I was so impressed with the epilogue where you talk about the John Lewis funeral, but also how you tie together that kind of moment in the summer of 2020 during the first months of the COVID pandemic and after the murder of George Floyd. And there's this whole debate about memory of the Civil War and the monuments and that kind of thing. And it seems as though that was the perfect time for you to be finishing off this book and kind of tying things together.
Unfortunately, yes. And I think, certainly, again, I said the Queen's funeral, but in the era of COVID, I mean, more than 1 million Americans have died of COVID. And I don't know that we're looking it in the face as much as, we could. I know we're not as much as we could, perhaps as we should. But I do think that it is a good time to kind of reckon with and think about the ways in which death can be politicized, right? And that is something we can certainly recognize in today's America. And to think about the meaning of death and the meaning of mourning and the cultural and political work that kind of can do in our culture. It was a really searing time to be thinking about that. And I think it still is. And we can't do the history of our present moment, as a historian, I can't tell you all of what it means, but I can definitely see the echoes of that. And I think it might give us some of the critical tools to look back at the Civil War in the 19th century and to understand it from a slightly different angle than we would have 10 years ago, let's say, because a lot of those monuments have been questioned and a lot of people have died, and public mourning and the lack of public mourning is something that's notable now. So I think it can really, tragically, probably enrich our perspective on history. And we're also in one of those moments where we don't know how it's going to turn out, but we know we're experiencing a cataclysmic time, or we've just been through it, or maybe we're not through it, depending who you ask. And so similar to the 1860s, where in the scale of potential change and challenge to the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to end on. It's such a timely book with a lot of relevance for today. And I couldn't agree more about the sense over the last couple of years that we've been living through history. We don't know what's going to happen next. Nobody does. And it certainly helped me, and I think my students here at Virginia Tech understand the perspective of the Civil War generation that little bit better.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all the great questions very much.
Yeah, I would like to thank the audience as well for being with us tonight and bringing some wonderful questions. I also want to thank the donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. They make possible this and everything else that the center does. So I'm really grateful for their support over the years. And most of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Purcell, for giving us a wonderful talk. It's a great book. I recommend it to everyone. And yeah, thanks for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Good night. Thank you.